what a great panel. I feel like a child going into a toy store and seeing all these wonderful things and I don't know where to start. Do I grab the teddy bears? Do I go to the little trains? Which of all the wonderful things that have been talked about? Now, now, I'm a little bit of a ringer here because I've actually read the book that they presented, and I read it, I've commented on it, and I've contributed to it. So it doesn't come to me as much of a surprise. But listening to it, and having done some work in the meanwhile on the same subject, because I'm doing a book that overlaps with this, I have some questions about what is really a common theory. So this is as much questioning things that I have been working on as this. So the first question is, what is uniquely global Southy about the position of trying to preserve sovereignty? This issue has now come up in the North and has led to a number of changes in the standard U.S. model bid and other agreements. There's fights in Europe. So what is it about this sort of project that is described in the book that is unique to the Global South? There's an answer to that, but I don't think that it was put forward yet. If there is something that is unique to the Global South that brings the countries in the Global South together to challenge the conventional BITS architecture and normative structure, why haven't they gotten together to do something about it? Why haven't the BRICS taken this up as an issue, if in fact they have common interests and common visions? And it's not, it's not because they don't talk to each other. They meet every year. They have a million different meetings, and the BRICS, that is. So why hasn't this come up as a common project? And then, where is the 800-pound gorilla in the story? What is the 800-pound gorilla in this story? China. Does China share the normative vision that was outlined here? Not so much. China is as much enthusiastic about BITS in the conventional sense as the Americans, even more so now that the Americans are beginning to sort of worry about people suing them, So I think that there are some real questions about sort of identifying a common global Southness, as opposed to a series of interests of different countries, some of whom are converging. But then you have to ask, okay, what is the Global South anyway? If it's every country with a per capita income of under 10,000, that's kind of a World Bank contribution. By the way, that would put Brazil out of the Global South, maybe 12,000. We had to move it up to keep in the club. But I think that these are really questions that need to be answered. Now, 5 years ago, something like that, I wrote a paper which argued that there were common interests in the Global South, that they were at odds with the trade and investment regime, and that the BRICS would get together and organize themselves to challenge a lot of the normative and organizational structures. Well, 5 years on, haven't seen much happening, and so it's forced me to ask some questions. The understanding in that paper, which doesn't come out in the presentation you made, but is in the book, is that there are common commitments, and now we go back to the morning, state-led development. That is, what distinguishes most of the emerging economies from the United States or Germany, it's not necessarily their per capita incomes, but that's important. That's not the only thing. But it's a greater commitment to state-led development, to which both the trade regime and the bilateral investment regime are somewhat hostile, or even very hostile. So that has to be part of what is meant here, which means that Chile, which is much more a neoliberal free market, is not in your global south. If the global south is defined by having a particular development strategy that's at odds with so this gets into the complexity of trying to figure out what are we really talking about here, and what are the politics of it, because behind all this has to be some politics, some idea that some kind of coalition, some kind of organizational consensus would have to emerge if there's actually going to be transformation. Now, on the issue of right to regulate, policy space, all these different words, maintaining sovereignty, blah, 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 there's really consensus between the North and the South, at least to some degree. So then the question is, okay, where does that consensus fall apart, and what are the things that, say, Brazil or India or China or, they care more about? That seems to me to where that project needs. We all have to do this, because I think we've been focusing too much on the areas of commonality, which we can identify intellectually, but then haven't been the source of any organizational activity by these very countries. Why is that? That's a question. Now, one of the things that I think that we should be thinking about is the complexity of the engagement of the global South with the global sort of post-neoliberal economic order. This guy at the FGV, Stunkel, has really just published a very good paper on the BRICS Bank, in which he tries to understand the complexity of the relationship. It's not one of hostility, and it's not one of complete agreement. It is some complex and contradictory relationship. I think all of the thinking about this issue, as we try to think, because there is something to the global South and there is something to the normative challenge, but it is a very complicated business, okay? So that's my first point. That's the first thing that got me excited. Now we go to governance, okay? Here comes governance. So this is another thing that I've worked on. But you're absolutely wrong that there's no new governance in their book, because the Brazilian version of investment agreements is essentially a governance agreement. It's not real. I mean, there are treaties, but the treaties say almost nothing, right? They're basically creators of process, of a kind of interrelationship between the two countries, between their governments, between the public and the private sector. It's a governance model, I'm telling you. And this is the unique thing about the Brazilian version of investment agreements that has to be brought out. So while you're right that most of the bits and much of this is public international law in a rather conventional sense, or even Weberian, if I may refer to that, I think there is an overlap. Now, de-Weberianization, I love it. Thank you very much. I'm going to now, use it because it's a wonderful word. It probably sounds better in German, though, so we... anyway. Look, let's go from these Brazilian investment agreements to the new governance literature, to the new developmental state. Because what was the theory of the new developmental state as put together in this room over the period starting in 2007 when we started the Lands Project? And that's when I met you, Flori. wasn't it, in 2007 at FGV in Rio? That's when I met him. And that's we were here, and that's when we started the project on law in the new developmental state. Well, the new developmental state literature was very much an effort to build into development theory a lot of the insights of the governance literature, particularly things by Sable and people like that who are great proponents of governance and so on. So this all comes together. Now, if you go back to this morning, the answer about what happened in Brazil and where we were wrong in the book was that there wasn't much new about the Brazilian developmental state. It was really very much drew on rather older ideas of developmental state activity and operation. So that was another problem in addition to all the other things that people pointed out. So I think that you know, you can put together the governance part and the and you can do that, but I think that the big takeaway that I'd like to leave my good friends and colleagues and actually co-authors on another, because we also did an article together that dealt with this more in the trade area, is that we have not figured out yet the complexity of the interrelationship between the global whatever, South whatever it is that we're going to call it, I mean, in the hegemonic order. And that we need to do much more work on. And you can't think about it without thinking about China, because that's the 800-pound gorilla in the story.
Uma questão? Ok, então, muito obrigado a todos os painelistas. Enfim, a gente tem que passar para o último painel. Então, obrigado a vocês. Eu fiquei responsável pelo tempo e, mais uma vez, eu fracassei.
Obrigado.
Obrigado, Floriano. Desculpa, vocês querem responder, é isso? Por favor. Ok. Please. As palmas ficam revogadas.
Eu vou iniciar respondendo uma parte em português para o Salem. No que diz respeito a essa pesquisa, eu acho que ela tem duas dimensões, né? Uma dimensão mas diante de um objeto, de uma relação econômica concreta, que é a relação Brasil-Angola. E, nesse caso, são diferentes instrumentos, sim, que são considerados mais do que os acordos, né? O passo de elaboração internacional, enfim, são diferentes momentos de uma mesma pesquisa. Enfim, eu não coloquei isso tão sistematizado como a Maíra fez em relação à pesquisa dela, mas é isso, um projeto que começa com uma pesquisa empírica mais descritiva de uma relação bilateral e a diversidade de arranjos jurídicos que a gente tem, considerando, como você mencionou, como regras e normas para essa relação, diferentes instrumentos públicos, privados. Mais do que tudo, o que mais nos chamou a atenção é o caráter híbrido desses instrumentos, o que tradicionalmente a gente não elabora e que há falhas sérias na doutrina para lidar com isso. E aí a tentativa de mostrar o organograma nesse sentido. Enfim, esses atos executivos, grande parte deles não estão nos manuais. Muitos desses acordos internacionais, atos bilaterais que o Brasil assinou, não estão em vigor formalmente, mas vários deles já foram completamente implementados, dizem respeito a linhas de financiamento que foram completadas, são considerados como obrigações cumpridas. Enfim, a gente não terminou um processo de formalização. Então, a gente tem vários pontos específicos desse espaço, e esse foi um dos momentos da pesquisa. O segundo momento da pesquisa, e aí apresenta FE, then Dave, I start to answer that in English, is that when we started to figure out the design of the Brazilian investment agreements, was that trying to understand how that came out in the Brazilian context. But then start to compare that with what was happening in other countries. Even countries that was in conformity with what was going on, like Chile. It was not so much a problem, and it was not a problem. And for India, it was a different problem from what it was for Brazil. And South Africa, we had completely different concerns behind there. So I guess that the politics behind our book, it's not to find one recipe or one answer to that. It's just trying to oppose to the mainstream narrative of having just one model, of having the idea of that everyone needs to have one common policy. We probably don't need that. We should respect the diversity of countries. And this is not a claim that we can find like at the international level, at interstate relations. We can find that in society. So people are asking for the recognition of diversity. And we should be able to incorporate that in law. Law is not respecting. Law in the last years has asked us to look for one model, one type of person, and one rule. And I guess that this is the claim behind this book. It's not really trying to find what is common and what is the new alliance that we'll have in the next future. So then I leave to Fabio to complete that.
Okay, so I agree with most of the points that Dave has raised, but I do not agree with your point on the right to regulate. I actually think that there's a blind spot here, and that's something that I want to explore right now, and I will be glad to talk to you more in depth about it. But I do think that the entire discussion about the right to regulate, when you think in the context of countries in the North, they're mostly concerned about negative externalities that can be summarized in environmental, health, safety. And if you read the bilateral investment treaties, these new models, they have exceptions on those specific issues. I do think that the right to regulate for countries in the Global South is much broader. So that's why I brought the example of the South African case, because I think that if you do have a bit with the exceptions that the countries in the North are proposing, you're not going to respond to the demands of that particular country and the communities affected, because that's as I said, a distributive justice issue. And maybe you can argue, oh, maybe the Constitution is too discursive, or too, you mentioned another word that I can't remember now, narrative, or maybe it goes too far. But I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that that's the case. I do think that there is if I'm successful in promoting or in this argument, I do think that the reform that some developing countries are trying to promote they do have a more subversive function in the system, because they're, in the end of the day, what they're trying to do through this new or to this blind spot in the right to regulate, it's to reconceptualize the entire system and to bring more balance to a relation that is completely unbalanced, in my view.
Podemos aplaudir?